Oh, hi, I didn't see you there. Welcome to This Mortal Plane. My name is Aaron. This go round, we're going to be building this rocking chair, which I have dubbed the Lemmy. The chair is made of solid cherry with a woven seat and woven back. Let's get into it.
Okay, getting started this time, you'll note this project makes copious use of router templates. I made these templates from 1/2" MDF to begin the project, and here I'm using the templates to lay out my rough stock so I can cut everything to rough dimension. Given the shape of some of these parts, using the templates to lay out the needed pieces allows me to nest pieces together and get more yield from the rough stock. Had I used S4S for every single piece, I would have needed much wider and or longer stock to get everything I needed. And be sure to label each part. Next, I'll rough cut my material and get to milling. I start at the chop saw to break the pieces down in length, and then I'll move to the bandsaw to very roughly cut out blanks for each part. More on that process after milling. Milling is, however, the same as always. Joint one face, joint one edge, then plane the opposite face square. This leaves me with parallel faces and one 90-degree edge from which to reference later. Nice and flat. After milling, I'll move to the table saw and use the templates to set up the crosscut sled to cut my joinery faces for the leg assemblies. Okay, truth time. This project has actually been going on for the last few months in the background of my other builds, and eagle-eyed viewers will see I'd already cut the joinery for these parts, which I'm now cutting off. Long story, but I changed my original plan just a little bit. I was originally planning to miter the joint. Oh, get it. Oh, yeah. Anyway, but over time I began to fear the stress on that joint being end grain to end grain would cause it to fail. So I remade the templates and remilled material for the rockers and recut those joint faces on the other pieces. During this whole pivot, I glued up a sub-assembly of the arms, legs, whatever, to attach to the new rockers that you see barely peeking out in the foreground here, and use sandpaper on a piece of MDF to true up that joint, which I'm checking now. It looks good! And no surprise, but I'm using floating tenons for the joinery. I use my super dominoes for the joints of the arm assembly, and two 10mm dominoes for the rockers. Which brings us to our first sub-assembly. You'll note that when I remade the rockers, I left the bottom of the stock square to give me a solid clamping surface. Had I rough cut the rockers already, I'd be dealing with a much more difficult clamping situation. This way it went easy breezy. In my first attempt with these assemblies, I had already cut and pattern routed the pieces before attempting this glue up, which made clamping, let's call it less than ideal. Chalk it up to the first of many lessons that I learned on this build. But once this was all good, we could move to cutting the rockers to shape. I typically use a Sharpie when laying out templates because the thickness of the line allows me some grace when cutting at the bandsaw, allowing me to cut on the line while leaving just enough material behind to take away with the flush trim bit in the router later. However, with some careful maneuvering, this cut is pretty good straight off the saw, and it rocks pretty well already. Then, through the magic of editing, we take a journey through time and space where I've already done all of the pattern routing on this and can move on to profiling. So after flush trimming off camera, I knew I wanted to add a heavy bullnose to the rocker legs, so I set to do that at the router table. I did this in multiple passes to avoid taking too much at once, and then moved to a slightly tighter radius for the inside of the rocker leg subassembly. Another thing I knew I wanted to do was add a wider armrest to this assembly. This design is heavily indebted to Sean Boyd from Sean Boyd Made This and his design of the Glen chair, named after Ohio native John Glenn. Woot woot. I've built Sean's Glen chair before, and I knew I wanted a wider armrest for one's elbows on my chair, so I started by making a template from MDF. Once satisfied with the shape of the template, I traced it onto the offcut of the rocker, rough cut the shape at the bandsaw, and then routed it flush using the template as a guide. I don't know why I don't have any footage of any of the template routing. I swear I filmed it, but here we are. Most of the shaping of the arms, however, was done by hand using rasps and a spoke shave, refining the shape until I found something I was satisfied with. Though quite time-consuming, I really enjoyed this part of the build. I don't get to use the spoke shave enough. To attach the arms to the rocker assembly, I used 3 5mm dominoes. This would be a long-grained glue joint, which would be plenty strong, but given the shape of the arms, I knew I wanted to use dominoes to help stop everything from sliding around when gluing everything up. I knew it would be easier to glue up if I kept everything square, but it would be easier to shape the arm as a separate piece. So, I went this route. Another thought I had was to use a long sliding dovetail from the front of the assembly to mechanically lock the pieces together, but I decided against it to keep the look of the front of the leg clean. I considered possibly using an old luthier's trick and using surgical tubing to get even clamping pressure across the whole joint, but I found it easy enough to just use a bunch of F-clamps. Typical for me, I spent a lot of time fretting over it in anxious anticipation just to find the solution was simple and straightforward, and literally the first thing anyone else would have ever thought about. Anyway, since order of operations required me to do the leg shaping before doing this glue up, I stopped plenty shy of where I knew the arm was going to get attached when routing the bullnose, meaning I had some handwork to do to shape the transitions. I did all of this with a rasp and followed it up with a little bit of sandpaper. Like the spoke shave, I really enjoyed this work. I really enjoy using rasps to shape pieces like this. It's slow, contemplative work, and I'm a slow, contemplative kind of guy, I guess. And now that's going to move us on to the stretchers. These may or may not be structurally necessary, but I decided to add a front and back stretcher between the legs for more strength and stability, given that this is a rocking chair and the legs will see quite a lot of stress. Both stretchers are made from 7/8 inch thick cherry, first cut to width at the table saw, then cross cut to length. Each stretcher then received one 10mm domino on each joinery face. If you've not got a domino, you can achieve the same ends with a mortising jig and a router, or simply use something like a doweling jig. That's a perfect application. I like the domino here mostly for the plunge into the leg assembly, as lining that up with a dowel center and a doweling jig would be quite fussy, but, use what you got. On to more assembly. This was a nice, stress-free glue up. I glued the dominoes into the stretchers ahead of time, so I had even less to worry about, and wouldn't you know it, everything went smoothly. Love it when a plan comes together. Set everything aside to cook in the clamps overnight, and called it a day. Next up was the seat. I went back and forth with a few designs here, but ultimately decided to stick with the inspiration from Sean Boyd's Glen chair and built a seat assembly nestled inside what I'm calling the seat sides, for which I'm cutting the miters here. Once that was all good, I went to laying out the taper using a long rule. I went from, 3 inches to 1 inch along the length of the seat side, striking a line and then scribbling on the offcut side so I don't confuse my easily addled brain. And then I went to cut the taper using my shop-made tapering jig. And they look like this when they're done. Ooh, nice. I'll glue up the seat sides into sub-assemblies next. I added a 5mm domino to help keep everything aligned and for a little extra strength along that miter. You may also spy with your little eye that I'm also using these clamping jigs that I got years ago to assist in the glue up, as they allow me to clamp across the joint and get a good perpendicular force along the glue face. If you don't have these clamping jigs, you can make them, or a jig using wedges could work too. There's always another way with woodworking, and mine is probably the wrong one. Anyway, the real focus of this design is the woven seat and back, which requires a frame to be suspended between the seat sides we just finished clamping up. This is a basic 4-sided assembly, but as you can see, the sides are slightly inset to make room for the weaving to come. So I got everything laid out and I marked the edges I knew the weaving would wrap around, as I want to put a heavy round over on all those edges, which I will next do at the router table. I was, for once, smart enough not to pre-assemble the frame, which made routing this profile at the router table much, much easier. you know, we got to take the wins where we can find them. Also, these pieces are awfully small, and I only have 10 fingers, so I'm using paddles to keep my hands away from the spinning bit of dismemberment. I would advise you do the same. But then I can get on to the assembly, another straightforward glue up with no fuss. I got it cooking in the clamps, and then moved on to the crest rail. This design uses a convex crest rail at the top of the seat back with a matching rail at the front of the seat. I don't have a drawing bow, and drawing the curve is really a three-handed operation, so I use 2 clamps and a flexible rule to get the job done just fine. After striking the line, I move to the bandsaw to rough cut the curve, staying just outside of my layout line. And then I refine the curve on the belt sander. If I make many more of these chairs, I will likely make a template of the curve to use the same flush trim routing operation as with all of the other parts of the build, but for now, I'm content to just refine this with sanding. With only 2 of these parts to worry about, there's really not much of a difference in time invested. And the result is perfectly adequate. Then I'll give each of the parts of the seat assembly a thorough sanding before assembling the seat, going up to 220 grit for every part. This requires attaching the frame and each of the 2 rails to each of the seat's sides, which looks much quicker and significantly more efficient in the edit here than it was in actuality. And because I was wearing my new Rust shirt, the best hardcore band out there doing the thing right now, I put on my +1 green flannel of protection to avoid any glue lines on my belly, a problem that has plagued me many, many times before. The most difficult part of this glue up is just aligning all of the tenons to add the second seat side. This is especially difficult to do without dragging wet glue from the tenons all over the freshly sanded seat side, but a little patience goes a long way here. And then after wrestling everything into place, I'll add clamps across each joint to ensure that all of the joints are closed. Any glue squeeze out gets wiped away with a damp sponge, another staple Norm move. I also sometimes use a wet toothbrush like Phil Lowe when needed. Some folks like to let the glue set a bit and then clean it up with a chisel, but I am both too highly strung and too anxious to wait to do that. So here we are. After the glue sets and the clamps are removed, a little shaping of the seat sides is in order. I use a rasp to shape the seat sides to match the convexity of the crest rail. Is convexity a word? I know concavity is a word. Anyway, one thing about building chairs is that you can spend dozens of hours working on a chair, machining materials, shaping parts, cutting joinery, doing all that stuff, all before you know if the chair is comfortable to sit in or not. It's kind of incumbent to the purpose of a chair to like sitting in it, so I was happy to report that it's pretty comfortable. I sat there rocking for much longer than the edit would lead you to believe. I also pretended to be asleep for a minute, thinking it would be funny to hard cut to me asleep in the chair, but after reviewing the footage and realizing I just looked dead, I decided to cut it out. Well, anyway, on to the weaving. This was a first for me, and I definitely learned a lot while going through this process. I leaned heavily on an excellent video from Woodcraft magazine, which I'll link in the description. But the process starts by sizing the strips. Once sized, I'll use the first strip as a guide to cut the number of strips needed for both the seat and the back, as the width is the same for each. Also, since I'm using nylon and not cotton, I found it useful to burn the ends of the webbing to stop them from fraying while stapling. But to get into the process of the weaving, I'll start with the ends, wrapping the strip over itself and stapling. Even though this is the seat bottom, I was trying to be conscious of the staple placement and direction, keeping everything uniform. But it was admittedly a very awkward endeavor, and wasn't easy to keep the staples as clean as I would have liked. Anyway, I shot 3 staples into the webbing, then pulled it over and across the top of the frame to the opposite side. The tricky part here is keeping the webbing taut, while also folding it over itself and tucking it under to be stapled. Also, I didn't realize until I'd finished the first strip that I actually intended to pull the webbing around to the inside face of the seat frame, but that's yet another lesson learned and applied for when I move to the seat back. But again, 3 staples through the webbing, and we've got our first run. I repeated this over and over and over again until I had the whole field complete. Once my elbow gets out of the way, it's onto the perpendicular pieces. Here's where I messed up. I started with the ends just like before. Everything was good. I wanted to ensure the ends were both woven with the same pattern, starting under the first piece of webbing. So I did the two end pieces first, going under, over, and so on, wrapping around the frame and stapling just like before. So far, so good. It occurred to me after doing this, though, that I wouldn't know the orientation of the middlemost strip of webbing without knowing how many pieces of webbing would be required. So I decided to weave all of the strips without attaching any before proceeding to stapling. Still, so far so good, and I have to give myself credit for realizing this with foresight, which, frankly is not my strongest suit. I meticulously wove all of the remaining strips, just like you see here. Still cooking with gas. So I marked the center of the frame, which I just pointed to with my hot dog finger, and attached the center strip. Or so I thought. This is actually where I messed up, as I attached the wrong strip to the center of the frame. I was off by one. Now, had I realized this in the moment, I would have just pulled the staples. No easy task, but I would have done it and attached the correct one. But I didn't notice it in the moment, and instead proceeded to attach almost all of the other strips before realizing my error. So I just decided to live with it, as there is enough wiggle room to get them more evenly spaced from up top, and most people aren't even going to notice. I learned from the mistake and did not repeat it when weaving the back, so it's not too big of a deal. I pre-finished the seat before weaving, knowing some parts would be inaccessible once the weaving was complete, but now it's time to finish the rest. I used, as usual, hard wax oil for this, and ultimately applied 2 coats. They call it monocoat, but that's a misnomer in my opinion. I prefer the feel and sheen of 2 coats, so that's what I did. But I'm mixing it up here. It's a 3-to-1 ratio finish, and boy, does the oil really make that cherry look fantastic. Also, cherry is just going to darken with age and exposure to the sun, so it's just going to get more and more beautiful the older it gets. Just like me. Just kidding, I'm a goblin. But as you can see, I used a white Scotch-Brite pad to buff the oil into the surface, and then came back shortly after to wipe away any excess that still remained. The ease of application is one of the benefits of using a hard wax oil, but I truly think it gives you the best of both worlds between appearance and repairability. I waited to attach the seat assembly to the legs until now, so first I need to sand back the finish where the seat will connect to the legs, as I intend to glue that joint. And of course, after getting it in the clamps, I couldn't resist giving it another sit. Again, this went on far too long in real life. We get it, it's comfortable. I am not, however, relying solely on glue for this connection. I'm going to add a dowel through the legs and into the seat sides for additional strength. I had intended to put the dowel through the seat side into the legs, but once everything was assembled, I realized this would be too difficult to execute cleanly, so I went this route. So I drill the hole with a brad point bit, always going in reverse to begin to score the edges and prevent any tear out, add some glue, and then pound the dowel into place. Once the glue is dry, I'll come back with a flush cut saw and saw off the excess. I like to drill a hole through a playing card in order to protect the surface beneath it, though you'll see I still managed to mar one leg with the flush cut saw. No matter, as I will use a chisel to come back and cleanly pare away the excess. Had I not accidentally hit the leg with the flush cut saw, I could go straight to applying the second coat of finish here, as a good sharp chisel leaves a beautiful surface. But in this case, I still had to come back with some sandpaper to lightly scuff the surface and then add the aforementioned second coat. No big deal. So I knew going into this build that the staples attaching the webbing on the seat back would be visible. However, after getting everything together and consulting with my most trusted advisor, my wife, I decided to build a little cherry frame to cover the staples. Nothing fancy, just glue and brad nails, friction fit into place, and then brad nailed into position. I will admit I was a little worried that you'd feel the frame on your back and it wouldn't be comfortable to sit in, but I can report it is completely unnoticeable and I think significantly elevates the look of the back.
Well, there you have it, folks. It's the Lemmy, a solid rocker. I had a lot of fun building this. I hope you had fun watching me build it. Join me next time, won't you? Okay.